की जय जय नित्य लीला प्रविष्ट ओम विष्णुपाद श्रीला गौर किशोर दास बाबूजी महाराज की जय जय नित्य लीला प्रविष्ट ओम विष्णुपाद श्रीला सच्चिदानंद भक्तिविंद ठाकुर की जय जय नित्य लीला प्रविष्ट वैष्णव सर्वभौम श्रीला जगन्नाथ दास बाबूजी महाराज की जय नमाचार्य श्रीला हरिदास ठाकुर की जय प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवसति गौर भक्त वृंद की जय श्री गौरी वैष्णव गुरु वर्ग की जय गंगामय की जय जमुनामय की जय भक्ति देवी की जय तुलसी देवी की जय अनंत कोटि वैष्णव वृंद की जय निताय गौर प्रेमानंदे हरि हरि बोल All glories to the Assembled Devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the Assembled Devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the Assembled Devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Vishnu Putale Srimati Radha Govinda Goswami Namine Namaste Prabhupada Devi Gauravani Pracharini Namaste Kanya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So I'm assuming we'll be reciting both the texts for today, which is text 29 to 30 of the third canto of this 22nd chapter. So Barhishmati Namapuri Sarvasampat Samanvita Nyapatan Yatra Romani Yagyasyangam Vidhunavataha Kushakashasta Evasan Shashvadharita Varchasaha Rishayo Yai Parabhavya Yagyagnan Yagnam Ijire Barhishmati Namapuri Sarvasampat Samanvita Nyapatan Yatra Romani Yagyasyangam Vidhunvataha Kushakashasta Evasan Shashvadharita Varchasaha Rishayo Yai Parabhavya Yagyagnan Yagnam Ijire Barhishmati Namapuri Sarvasampat Samanvita Nyapatan Yatra Romani Yagyasangam Vidhunvataha Kushakashasta Evasan Shashvadharita Varchasaha Rishayo Yai Parabhavya Yagyagnan Yagnam Ijire Parhishmati Namapuri Sarvasampat Samanvita Nyapatan Yatra Romani Yagyasangyam Vidhunvataha Kushakashasta Evasan Shashadharita Varjasaha Rishayo Yai Parabhavya Yagya Gyan Yajnami Jire Barhishmati Namapuri Patsamanvita Napatan Yatra Romani Yagnyasangam Vidunvataha Kushakashaste Vasan Shashvadharita Varchasaha Shashyoyai Parabhavya Yagnagnan Yagnami Jire Barhishmati Namapuri Sarvasampat Samanvita Nyapatan Yatra Romani Yagyasyangam Vidhunvataha Kushakashasta Evasan Shashvadharita Varchasaha Rishayo Yaiparabhavya Yagyagnan Yagnami Jire Barhishmati Barhishmati Nama named Puri city Sarva Sampat all kinds of wealth Samanvita full of Nyapatan fell down Yatra where Romani the hairs Yagyasya of Lord Boar Angam his body Vidhunvataha shaking Kushaha Kusha grass Kashaha Kasha grass Te they Eva certainly Asan became Shashvat Harita of evergreen Varchasaha having the color Rishayaha the sages Yahi by which Parabhavya defeating Yagyagnan the disturbers of the sacrificial performances Yagyam Lord Vishnu Ijire they worshipped. Translation. The city of Barhishmati, rich in all kinds of wealth, was so called because Lord Vishnu's hair dropped there from his body when he manifested himself as Lord Boar. As he shook his body, this very hair fell and turned into blades of evergreen kusha grass and kasha, another kind of grass used for mats, by means of which the sages worshipped Lord Vishnu after defeating the demons who had interfered with the performance of their sacrifices. Purport. Any place directly connected with the Supreme Lord is called Pithasthana. Barhishmati, the capital of Swayambhuva Manu, was exalted not because the city was very rich in wealth and opulence, but because the hairs of Lord Varaha fell at this very spot. These hairs of the Lord later grew as green grass, and the sages used to worship the Lord with that grass after the time when the Lord killed the demon Hiranyaksha. Yagya means Vishnu, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In Bhagavad Gita, karma is described as yagyartha. Yagyartha karma means work done only for the satisfaction of Vishnu. If something is done for sense gratification or any other purpose, it will be binding upon the worker. If one wants to be freed from the reaction of his work, he must perform everything for the satisfaction of Vishnu, or Yagya. In the capital of Swayambhuv Manu, Barhishmati, these particular functions were being performed by the great sages and saintly persons. And again the translation. The city of Barhishmati, rich in all kinds of wealth, was so called because Lord Vishnu's hair dropped there from his body when he manifested himself as Lord Boar. As he shook his body, this very hair fell and turned into blades of evergreen kusha grass and kasha, another kind of grass used for mats, by means of which the sages worshipped Lord Vishnu after defeating the demons who had interfered with the performance of their sacrifices. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gourangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Goratushe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyeva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, my apologies for running a little bit late this morning. As we are reading, we have just heard this description, right, of the abode or the capital of Swayambhuv Manu. And Prabhupada, he focuses very nicely on this title of Yagya for the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And of course, it's being rooted in the Bhagavad Gita, because the Bhagavad Gita is very much concerned with Yagya, right? We hear in the Upanishads, Srila Prabhupada, he cites it at the beginning of the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna, he defines, right, how we have our Vedic authority, right? Of course, our Vedic authority is threefold: Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, right? And Krishna, he manifests this. Firstly, he says, this is my opinion, right, in the 13th chapter. I remember Himanga Chaitanya Prabhu, he was giving class, and he was saying, it's rather funny, right, that Krishna sometimes says, this is my opinion, right? Of course, we often say, this is my opinion, that is my opinion, this is what I think, right? Because what role, what authority do we have to speak on these things, right? But if there's anyone, right, who has a right, who it would not be inappropriate to say, okay, you know, now you shut up and listen to me, right? This is how it is, right? It's Krishna. But still, nevertheless, Krishna, he plays this role of the guru, he plays this role of the teacher, and so he presents his idea by saying, this is my opinion, right? And then, of course, we hear, then later on, Krishna, he will say, you can hear this further on in the Vedanta, and so on and so forth. And this is, of course, referring to Shastra, right? And so almost to prove this point, or to demonstrate this point, Srila Prabhupada in his purport, he goes on to cite that same Shastra. Krishna also then refers to rishis and sages, which is where we get sadhu, right? So this is our threefold authority. Of course, as we know, in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srila Prabhupada, he says, of these three, sadhu, shastra, and guru, which one is the central one? We hear these are three pillars, but one is the central pillar, Shastra, right? Shastra is the most important of these pillars. Of course, we wouldn't want to do one without any of the others, right? If we study history, we can see that so many apasiddhantas, so many deviations from the true Vaishnava philosophy have come from stressing one of these over the other. There's a very famous example. If we overstress the guru, there is one Apasampradaya, right? And their leader is believed to be an incarnation of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, right? And so this leader was there, and he was there with one of his more prominent disciples. And this very prominent disciple was having a wedding, right? His daughter was getting married. And so during the wedding, this guru, this great acharya, he got up and he stood up and he began to completely strip naked and he started dancing like a madman, right, during the wedding. And during this, the disciple became very upset and he said, go away, you're ruining this very important day, right? And then this guru, what did he say? He said, oh, you're doing severe offense against a spiritual master. And not just the spiritual master, I'm Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. And so this disciple, he did what every rational person would, and he said, oh no, I've made such a grave error. And he very naturally accepted this person as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and as his spiritual master. So this narrative, it shows us, right, what happens if we overstress the guru, if we don't go to Shastra. Because if you go to this Upper Sampradaya, and I personally wouldn't recommend going to this Upper Sampradaya, you can ask them, right, where is all of your Shastric evidence, right? Where is all your Shastric evidence for your position that this personality is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu? Where is it? And they won't be able to show you any, right? And you can ask them, of all these historic sadhus who have come in the line of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which ones are accepting the conclusions of this apparent acharya, of this apparent incarnation? Well, you won't be able to find any, right? Simply on the words of their guru, they are going on like this, right? So we'll see many such cases. Today there is one very famous guru in India, and he gives many long talks about the Mahabharata, about Shiva, about Krishna, about all these different things. And once somebody asked him, have you read the Mahabharata, right? After he gave a long talk on it. And he said, no. He said, in fact, I have never read a book in my life. So this is the stature he's in. And if you hear him speak, complete rascaldom, right? Not even just Mayavad, like nonsense Mayavad, is the first. Actually, this is the position. Me and Mrugang Prabhu were running a preaching group together. And some of the Mayavadis that come in, it's the only time in my life I want to tell somebody, please read Shankaracharya. You're not even representing Mayavad correctly at this point, right? It's all just speculation. It's all just deviated. And in fact, this is the position. If you speak to many Mayavadis, and again, not something I would recommend, but the traditional Mayavadis, the traditional holders of the line of Shankaracharya, they will all be very upset with the majority of modern-day Mayavadis, because none of them actually teach what Shankaracharya taught, right? They all teach all of these bogus sort of speculations. I mean, of course, we don't accept the conclusions of Shankaracharya as much as we accept Shankaracharya as a great personality. The most significant one, and very interestingly, is that they will say they've gone away from Shastra. It's very interesting. The contemporary Mayavadi will say, I don't need this, I don't need that. You'll hear some of them say, I don't need Shastra. All that I need to know for self-realization is on the back of a rock. And they'll say things like this, right? They'll say, just my experience is enough to prove Advaita, right? But if you read or hear the criticisms that the traditional Mayavadis have, is that even Shankaracharya said, one can only attain liberation through studies of the Shastras, right? So even in the Mayavadi lines, they're rejecting Shastra and they're becoming even more deviated, right? If they were to stay in studies of the Shastras, they would become like Ramanujacharya or Madhvacharya, who began in Mayavadi lines, but after the studies of Shastras came to Vaishnav conclusions. Anyways, so Srila Prabhupada, he discusses the Pancha Koshas, right? The 5 Koshas in his purport to this text in the beginning of the 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. And of course, we know these koshas, right? The most outward one is the Annamaya Kosh, right? This is existing on the platform of just, wanting to eat, right? This is, we could say, the majority platform of people today, right? I went to my high school reunion a few months ago, 5-year reunion, right, after our graduation. And I was talking with one of my friends, and I was really thinking, Hari Bol, right? He was telling me, I told him, what are you doing with yourselves? And he said, I've become now an electrician, right? And of course, in Australia, being an electrician is it's actually a very sustainable career, right? You can make a very good living for yourself. And so I asked him, okay, that's very nice, you're richer than even the medical students at this point, right? So what are you doing? And he said, I'm eating, I'm sleeping, and then I'm eating, and then I'm sleeping, right? And then I asked him, but you're making all of this money, what are you doing with it, right? And he said, sometimes I'll go to really nice restaurants, And then sometimes I'll go to the pub. And then I said, oh, what do you do at the pub? And he says, oh, I drink and then I eat. And I thought, okay. See, he's having very maximal freedom, actually, to live. If you have money, you have freedom in the material world, right? So-called freedom. And what is he using it for? To eat different varieties of food. You'll see this also. Sometimes you'll ask people, I have this at university, they'll make you do icebreaker activities, right? And you'll do an icebreaker activity and you get to, you have to know the other person and they'll make you do, it's actually terrible. For those of us who've been through university, I'll know it's a real tapasya, all of these icebreaker activities. And when you get to know the other person, they'll tell you their hobbies, their interests. And I still remember once I was there and I had to do this icebreaker activity with this one Mataji at the university. And so we were saying, what are your hobbies? And she said, my hobby is to eat brunch, right? So if you don't know, brunch is when you have your breakfast and your lunch combined. I thought, wow, what a fantastic hobby, you've moved your meal times and joined them together. This is some real, combination of some really creative act of the material nature. So we'll see like this, right? Annamaya kosh, right? And we can consider this to be the most external. Actually, Srila Prabhupada, he writes, nevertheless, all of these are permutations of the Lord's energy. There's still some potency behind them, right? Because these are all different ways of engaging with the Lord's energy as the kshetra. We know this is the topic of the 13th chapter, kshetra gya, so on and so forth. Then, of course, higher than that, we have pranamaya, right? And the pranamaya kosh we can see is also predominant in society today. We saw this during the COVID sort of era, which we are finally concluding, right? Everyone's discussion was, how do we stop people dying, right? Of course, I am not making any commentary on a policy or anything, but this was everyone's meditation, right? You heard every single day, what was everyone, even devotees, right? Devotees would always be talking about, this is the best way we can prevent dying, this is the best way. And of course, we should take care of our bodies, right? We should take care of our bodies in the service of Krishna. But there's a certain point where one is purely meditating just on how can I extend my life, right? People were going through keeping up to date with all of these statistics and everything just to get an idea how many lives are being maintained, right? Will my life be maintained? People were completely obsessing. Every single day we would hear, I remember I would sometimes spend time with some devotees and you'd hear for hours just discussions on this trend and that trend and this trend and that trend, right? So this is the prana maya kosh. It's trying to preserve one's life. Then we go a little bit higher, and this is actually the point upon which I wish to touch upon, which is, of course, the Jnanamaya Kosh, right? And the Jnanamaya Kosh is interesting, right? Ramanujacharya, he gives a very interesting definition for it. He says those in the Jnanamaya Kosh are those who are properly participating in Varnashrama society. This is what the Jnanamaya Kosh is. And we might wonder, what does Jnana have to do with Varnashrama, right? But this is a very important principle, and it ties to this emphasis of yajna. Because what is Varnashram society based on? The Vedas, right? It is Vedic society. We often hear Vedic society being thrown around. Vedic society means you should act in this way or that way. I still remember I was reading one booklet produced, and it said, Krishna likes things to be Vedic / Indian. And I had a little giggle because, of course, this is not the full definition of Vedic. I understood the point that was being made, of course, that Indian culture, I forgot who was saying it. One very senior sannyasi, Srila Prabhupada disciple, was saying that we can think of Indian culture almost to be like a dead body, right? The living body was the Vedic culture, and Indian culture is like the dead body, right? You can still kind of piece together what the living body was like by looking at the dead body, but it's lost the vitality, right? So anyways, I understood what they were saying, but Vedic culture is something much, much deeper than one simple geographical expression of some culture. Vedic culture is based on Veda. And what is Veda? What literally the definition of Veda is? Knowledge, right? So jnana is knowledge, jnanamaya kosh is to act in varnashram, right? And so therefore to act in varnashram is to act built on the principles of Veda, of knowledge. And what do we hear about this Varnashrama society? Varnashrama society is strictly defined against our current society. Our current societies and the majority of Western societies on earth today are what we would call liberal capitalist economies, right? And these are built on principles, A, of freedom, my rights, right? This is what I deserve, right? This is my right. I have a right to this. And the capitalism means the society is built on what I want to take. I take from this person, they take from that person, this person takes from me, and like this society goes, right? I take from my boss, right? And then I take this, and then I take that, and then my boss takes my labor from me, right? We are all taking from each other, and because we're taking from each other, we are in a very happy society, right? Of course, Varnashram flips that on its head, right? Varnashram thinks in the opposite direction. Varnashram is not, how can I take from you? Or what do I demand from you? Which rights do I demand from you? But rather, what do you demand from me? Right? We hear in Varnashram society, the king's job is to do X, Y, and Z, right? The king is doing this and this and this. And if the king is doing all of these things, then everyone's so-called rights are being satisfied. But the consciousness is different. The consciousness is not one of, I deserved this, I needed this, I wanted this, my ego is in the center, I am taking. This is the consciousness of the contemporary demonic society, right? No, the consciousness is, I must give to this person, right? I must do for this person, right? So the economy is based very differently. And what is that economic principle? It is the principle of yajna, right? We see this also. Srila Prabhupada has referenced the Bhagavad Gita. We see this also in the earlier chapters of the Bhagavad Gita. The yajna cycle, right? When one gives in sacrifice, then everything is provided for, right? We hear about how there's that wonderful cycle. And just by giving in sacrifice, all of one's food grains are provided. And what does one do with those food grains? Do they hold on to them and say, okay, I've done my part, I've given in the sacrifice, so then now I can retain these? No, then one gives them once again in sacrifice. It is what they call a giving economy, right? Unlike a taking economy, which is the economy we are in today. And so therefore yajna is performed. And yajna is performed very beneficially in society in order for healthy society to exist. Then of course, if we keep on going with the koshas, right? Then higher than the jnana maya kosh is of course the vijnana maya kosh. And we can consider this to be when the conclusion of these yajnas is reached, right? Because when one begins to giving, right? When one gives, they've begun to subvert the ego, the ahankar. The reason we are in this material world is because we want to take. And varnashram and yajna teaches us to give, right? It teaches us, okay, you are not the taker. Of course, most people will engage in varnashram in order to take ultimately, right? I give in sacrifices so I can have a healthy life. I give in sacrifices so that I'm doing the right thing. But it's a step in the right direction, right? It's a step in beginning to teach one to give rather than to take. And when one gives and gives and gives, they begin to cultivate, at the very least, the mode of goodness, right? Varnashram is an evolutionary process. And when one cultivates the mode of goodness, vijnana maya kosh, they are then able to discern the difference between body and soul, right? And then, of course, discerning the difference between body and soul, Srila Prabhupada, he puts all of these koshas in one category, and then he says the kshetragya, with this desire to exploit, it's engaging with these. But something that is other than this kshetragya is the anandamaya kosh, which is, of course, transcendental enjoyment, right? And this transcendental way of engaging is when this act of giving is perfected, of course, in bhakti, in Krishna consciousness, when one is fully engaged, no longer concerned with taking and giving, right? Or rather, taking and taking. Purely giving is what becomes the purview of the person in this system. And therefore, yajna plays a very central role. Things only become meaningful, they only become valuable when they are engaged in yajna, right? We hear in the Chatur Shloki, right? Whatever you see around you is connected to me, and anything which you cannot connect to me, of course Krishna is speaking, right? And whatever you cannot connect to me is like the illusion born of shadow, right? That shadow-like illusion. We hear this. This is the principle of that which is real, that which is reality. It is that which is connected to Krishna. And yajna is the way by which we connect reality to Krishna, right? This is the other benefit of yajna. Yajna is the means by which reality, or rather which everything can be connected to Krishna. And when it is connected to Krishna, then it is truly real. When it is utilized separate from Krishna's purposes, then it is not really substantially real. Of course, not in a Mayavad sense. It's not that the object doesn't exist, but it is not truly put in its positionality to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And we can see this in the narratives of the Srimad Bhagavatam, right? Because when we think about it, history is a very interesting thing. I was reading this one author, his name's Hayden White, complete materialist, but I thought this point he made was very interesting, right? When we think of history, often people think of history as being one of the fields like science, like biology, like physics, right? Where it has very technical language. And what does the historian do? The historian goes and he puts away the mythology and he scientifically discovers what actually happened, right? This is often how history is presented, right? And this author, he himself is a historian. And he makes a point that to a degree this is the case, right? The historian tries to find historical events, right? And tries to show that they happened, right? But what he says is that the historian does not stop there. That is maybe an archaeologist who will find a historical event and isolate it. That is not what happens when one reads a history. When one reads a history, historical events are taken and they are weaved together into a story. He says, in a slightly edgy way to provoke the reader, he says that history, the role of the historian, is to take facts and to turn them into fiction. Of course, he doesn't mean fiction in the sense of something that didn't happen. He means fiction in the sense of narrative, of story, right? The historian takes a few events and he weaves them together into a story. And this story conveys something. This is the job of the historian. The historian conveys something through historical events. He uses the example of like the French Revolution, all these mundane examples, and he compares how one of the first histories of the French Revolution presents it as a tragedy, right? It's a very sad thing that happened. People tried something very nice and it completely went away. The second historian presents it as a comedy, right? And he's there to mock and to laugh at the leaders of the French Revolution, right? We see a similar principle in the Shastras, right? We see Vritrasura. If you read in the Rig Veda, Vritrasura's pastimes are there, right? And Vritrasura, he's there, and he's fighting Indra. But what do we read in the Rig Veda? Oh, he was some serpent-like demon, and he got killed by Indra. Done, right? Very nice, right? Because what is the hymns of the Rig Veda concerned with? They're concerned with demigods, right? They're concerned with siding with them, right? So it's taken a historical event. Indra has killed Vritrasura, and it has presented its story, its narrative, right? And its narrative is in line with the message of the text. And what is that message? That message is, wow, demigods are really, really nice. They're very, very cool, right? Of course, this isn't the ultimate message, and we know our acharyas have very nicely pulled together the Rig Veda and other Vedas to show that even there, Krishna consciousness is presented. But overall, we know Krishna himself says, right? By and large, they're flowery words, right? We find a similar thing. Also, the four Vedas, they have mention of Pururava, right? We know Pururava and Urvashi, right? And we hear the prayers of Pururava, but we don't hear anything else. We just hear his intoxicated hymns, right? His hymns aren't exactly for the demigods, right? And we hear about those hymns that he's made for Urvashi, and we hear nothing else. And also in the Mahabharata, what do we hear? We hear that the Pandavas, at the end of their pastimes, what do? They go to Svarga, right? Which is where all pure devotees go, right? But in Srimad Bhagavatam, we hear these same historical events, that the Pandavas left their bodies, right? That Maharaj Pururava was very much intoxicated by Urvashi, right? That that Vritrasura was killed by Indra. But what does Srimad Bhagavatam present? Srimad Bhagavatam presents all of these with a very different narrative, right? We hear about Maharaj Pururava eventually coming to his senses and realizing the futility of mundane lust, right? We hear that the Pandavas actually, they quit their body and they went back home, back to Godhead, right? And we hear that Vritrasura was actually a very transcendental devotee, a very transcendentally minded person who is subverting material categories. What is the purpose of this? I go back to Hayden White, my mundane point of reference here. And he says, right, that all of these narratives are there to make a point, to make a truth about the world, right? The historian's job is to illustrate truth with historical fact. And all of these texts, all of these shastras, they are presenting truths, but Srimad Bhagavatam is presenting transcendental truth. When the Mahabharata talks about the Pandavas, it's talking about material truth, right? It's talking about material truth that, it is good to go to Svarga. Very good, very good. This is a good material truth to have. But Srimad Bhagavatam comes in and it presents transcendental truth, that nothing in this material world satisfies, and the only dharma is Krishna consciousness. Then we hear, right? We hear in the pastimes of Vritrasura, right? What do we hear? In the Rig Veda, we hear a material truth, right? That the demons, they are the bad guys, right? And the demigods, they are the good guys, and we should side with the demigods. This is true, right? And this is true pertaining to the way the material world works. But what truth does Srimad Bhagavatam make? It makes a much deeper truth. And what is that truth? That good or bad, piety or impiety, Srila Prabhupada, he says this in one Nectar of Devotion lecture. We are not concerned with being pious in this Krishna conscious movement. We are concerned with being transcendental. That regardless of categories of piety, of impiety, what is the symptom? What is the factor that matters? It is spiritual realization. And wherever spiritual realization is, even if it's found in a demon, we should run to there, right? We should harvest that. We should hear that, right? This is the truth of Srimad Bhagavatam, right? Srimad Bhagavatam is engaging with history, but it is engaging with history anchored in one very highest truth. The other Vedic literatures, we accept them, of course, but we accept them insofar as they agree with the Srimad Bhagavatam. And the reason why is because the Srimad Bhagavatam takes all of these historical events, right? These historical facts, if you will. It takes them all and it ties them into what? Into Yam Sham Sundaram Achintya Gunaswarupam, right? Govindamadi Purusham Tamaham Bhajami. Into that Sham Sundar, right? Into that beautiful, wonderful Supreme Personality of Godhead. They tie all of them into that, right? And that's why the 10th canto is the summum bonum, right? That's why it is the focal point, right? You can almost feel that tension from the very beginning of Srimad Bhagavatam that we are leading up to hearing the pastimes of Krishna. This is the purpose of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and that is why it is the highest truth, because it is anchored in the essence of truth, which, as we know in the Chatur Shloki, is everything that is connected to that Supreme Personality of Godhead. And therefore, when we connect everything in this way, we can in this way almost think of the Puranic literature, right, as being yajna itself, right? It is a sacrifice of events. It is a sacrifice of history, right, which then presents and connects events, mundane history, with Krishna. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he makes this point. He says that the Mahabharata is all mundane, but it's not. Because it leads one. When one becomes interested in the intrigues of the Mahabharata, they become so interested that eventually they will meditate on Bhagavad Gita, right? This way, the Mahabharata is being used to position that truth, to convey that truth, right? Of course, this is natural when we think about it. Historical events, they have no relationship to each other, right? One historical event happens, and then another one happens, and another one happens. The job of connecting them all together into a story is the job of the historian, right? And now one might say, okay, well, one is presenting one history, another person is presenting another history. They're all the same, right? They're all different perspectives. This is the hot word right now. Oh, that's your perspective. This is my perspective. Oh, that's the perspective of the Srimad Bhagavatam. I remember once, again, while preaching, we had this one person come in, and he said, that's a nice perspective, and I like this perspective of the Srimad Bhagavatam, but my perspective, and I thought, wow, it's very interesting. He was a Mayavadi, and I thought, this is the very interesting position of the Mayavadis, right? It's almost like they're actually the biggest personalists, right? You won't find a bigger personalist than a Mayavadi. It's just that the person they're concerned with isn't the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it's their own false ego personality, right? They're very much built on the worship of this. I was thinking, wow, I could never imagine, right, going up and saying, this Vedic literature is all right, but me, I think I also have an equally valid opinion, right? My insights are as valuable. Anyways, but the difference is, again, that this Srimad Bhagavatam is the incarnation of Krishna. It is a literary incarnation of Krishna. And so when this Srimad Bhagavatam, and again, this is why we hold it, all other histories, even Vedic histories, are to be contrasted against this Srimad Bhagavatam. Because this Srimad Bhagavatam is the assertion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, saying you can make many histories out of historical events, but this is the absolute history. This is the essence of history. This is the complete history. And therefore, with that authority, we say that this history is the greatest history. Yes, all histories are stories generated from facts, right? But this is the one which is generated from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is why Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he says Chaitanya Charitamrita, it is the greatest text ever written. He says that every single syllable is aprakrit, right? It is all transcendental. Every single syllable is composed purely of non-material substance. Because every single syllable of the Chaitanya Charitamrita is directly relishing Krishna. Right? It is taking that message of Srimad Bhagavatam and it is pouring it out in such a way that every single moment of the Chaitanya Charitamrita is connected to that ultimate truth, which is Krishna. And it's because of this that the Krishna consciousness movement and that bhakti is so dynamic, right? You'll find rules and regulations are the concerns of every single process, right? I sometimes feel sad. I always feel sad for impersonalists, right? I feel especially sad for Mayavadis, right? But even impersonalists, right, who aren't being condemned to the very terrible places that they are, we know, ye yatham mam prapadyante tam stathaiva bhajamyaham. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in his purport to this text, he says that the Mayavadi who tells Krishna, oh, your body is material, right? And it has come into existence and it'll cease to exist. This Mayavadi, Krishna, he naturally reciprocates by giving this person material bodies which come into existence and leave existence perpetually. So very bad we feel for Mayavadis. But impersonalists, the Brahmavadis, not so bad. But then we hear about all the rules and regulations they have to undergo. Then you feel bad, Just come and have prasad and dance in a kirtan, It's so much easier on this side, right? But they have to follow these principles, right? Because they are not coming straight to the essence of the truth. When one is engaged in the essence of the truth, then all the details become unnecessary, right? Because one is coming to the essential living point. If truth was static, if truth was merely some facts, you hear like, was it Stephen Hawking who talked about the theory of the universe, right? That you can reduce the truth of the universe to an equation. If this was the case, then we wouldn't need to go anywhere for the truth but a phone book, right? That's filled with facts, right? These are all factually correct phone numbers. But this is not the nature of truth. Srimad Bhagavatam defines truth as Krishna, right? And Krishna dancing, that is truth. And Krishna dancing, it is dynamic. And because of that, Krishna consciousness is always transforming. It's always dynamic. If you look, Madhavananda Prabhu, he says there's nothing he hates more than the phrase traditional Gauriya Vaishnavism, right? People will say, the traditional way to do this. He says, Prabhu, there is no traditional way to do this. Every single generation in the parampara has completely changed and innovated. We would not be able to recognize at all the sadhana of the 6 Goswamis. Besides, kirtan and japa, besides these real essentials, they would be practicing something very different. even in the time of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, is something very different to what Srila Prabhupada established. In essence, 100% the same, but in details, very, very different, right? We'll find lots of differences in what is emphasized and what is pushed, but that is because the essence is there. It's also why bhakti is very hard to cheat in, right? We can, of course, cheat if we wish to get fame, name, and all of these sort of things. Then we can cheat, then we can fake these externals, whatever the details are at the moment, right? But because we are going to the essence, again, the essence of all truth, Krishna dancing, we can't cheat our way there. There is no ritual, there is no other way to get there, but simply engaging in bhakti itself. I was listening to one class by His Holiness Tamal Krishna Goswami. It was an initiation lecture. And so he was speaking on this point, and he was speaking about how once he was with, just after he got second initiation, right? He was there preaching to one devotee, and this devotee also got second initiation. And the wife of this devotee was very curious about the Gayatri mantras. So Tamal Krishna Goswami, he told the wife of this devotee the Gayatri mantras, right? And so once then Srila Prabhupada, he was speaking with Tamal Krishna Goswami, and somehow it came up, and Tamal Krishna Goswami, he told Srila Prabhupada, he said, "Oh, Srila Prabhupada, yeah, I told this devotee's wife, I told her the Gayatri mantras, she knows them." Then Prabhupada said, "No, you didn't." And then Tamal Krishna Goswami said, No, I told her them." And Prabhupada said, "No, you didn't." And then Tamal Krishna Goswami, he said, "Yeah, no, I gave her the Gayatri mantras." And then Srila Prabhupada, he said, "No, you didn't," right? And the point of this is that the essence is always there in Krishna consciousness. Nothing happens without that essence going forth, right? And if that essence is there, even the details can go away. In that same class, Tamal Krishna Goswami, he says a very famous pastime. He says it's often. Now I've forgotten which god brother it is. Maybe some of you can remind me as I go along. And this god brother asked Tamal Krishna Goswami, he said, "I've been chanting my Gayatri mantras, but I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing them correctly." Have we heard this pastime? So he says, "I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing them correctly. I'm getting self-conscious when I'm meditating on them. I'm not sure if I'm saying them correctly." Then Tamal Krishna Goswami says, you can tell this is the early days by how this conversation goes. He says, "Okay, let's go ask Srila Prabhupada if you're chanting them correctly," right? So they both go in front of Srila Prabhupada, and this god brother, he presents his dilemma to Srila Prabhupada, right? And then Srila Prabhupada says, "Okay, then recite the mantras to me, tell me them, right? So then I can hear if you're pronouncing them correctly." And then, can you imagine reciting the mantras in front of Srila Prabhupada? So he recites them in front of Prabhupada, and then Prabhupada, he hears them, and he begins to burst into laughter, right? He begins to laugh and laugh and laugh. And then he tells him, you've basically been saying gibberish, like this is just nonsense syllables. I can't remember the exact line, but Tamal Krishna Goswami says, you may as well have been going blah, 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 blah for all of the accuracy that had to the Gayatri mantras, right? But then what does Srila Prabhupada say? Srila Prabhupada says, but... He becomes very softened in that moment, and he says, "But because of your sincerity, Krishna, he will still accept." Again, when that essence is present, right? Then we find, that the details are not so important. Of course, the details are important, right? Because the disregard for the details is still an essential point. But that essence is what defines it, and that essence is dynamic. And again, what is that essence? That essence is affection for Krishna. We find this also then in the logo of the Gauriya Math, which was designed by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. For any of us, I think all of us have been to Mayapur. If you go to Mayapur, you'll see on the walls, right, of the ISKCON temple, I forgot now which entry, I think it's the West Gate, where you'll see these two big paintings of this logo. Srila Prabhupada had the devotees paint the Gauriya Math logo on the ISKCON campus, right? Of course, this is the Gauriya Math under Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, he's a Gauriya Math devotee," or "This is a Gauriya Math devotee." But actually, that's not true. The Gauriya Math doesn't exist anymore. The Gauriya Math is dissolved. Whenever we see a person who's associated with any of Prabhupada's god brothers, they're all these separate missions. The original Gauriya Math doesn't exist. They're all like Chaitanya Saraswat Gauriya Math, Gopinath Gauriya Math. They all have names like this. And so because of that, we think, oh, they are the original Gauriya Math, but they're actually not. They're as young as ISKCON, most of them, right? So Srila Prabhupada did this to emphasize that ISKCON is continuing this mission of the Gauriya Math, right? We are continuing this mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. And if you look at this logo, again, this logo was designed by Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. When you look at it, it's divided. Do we know the one I'm talking about? It has like, okay, I have to describe it then. It has like, it's a circle, and it has these two lines going down, like almost like an X, right? There are these two lines going down, and then on this left side, there's a very opulent, almost Lakshmi Narayan looking form, right? And then on this side, the right side, on the right side is Radha Krishna in Vrindavan, very intimate mood, right? And then beneath them, I can't remember now, it either says rag or raganuga. It says something along the lines of that, something spontaneous. And then on the other side, it talks about Vaidhi, right? And it separates them like this. And then on the top on each side, it has a different shastra. I've now forgotten which shastras are there, right? And in each one of these categories, as I've said, the Radha Krishna side is with rag, and then the opulent side is with Vaidhi. So it's separating them, right, in the two halves of the Gauriya Vaishnav mission, right, of the Madhurya and Aishwarya aspects, right? What's interesting, on the Vaidhi side, there are some symbols, there are some items, some objects that are also put in the logo. They're objects that we would expect, right? Archana items, basically. But on the rag side, there is a mridanga, from memory, and there is a symbol of book distribution, right? That is what's put on that side, which is very interesting, I find, right? We can find here Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada's conception, right, of what a spontaneous transcendental truth is, right? That it's expressed most dynamically in the dynamism of preaching, right? So this is where we find this dynamic truth of Krishna is found so thoroughly in preaching, right? Preaching is where we most thoroughly encounter this. And the reason why is because preaching is the only time where our details are not determined by what is best for our community, for the Vaishnav community, but what is best for the outside broader world, right? Preaching is where the details are adjusted not based on our sensibilities, but on the material world sensibilities. Our sensibilities don't change too much, right? We can think really in terms of our sensibilities, what has changed. Maybe a little less emphasis on rasic meditation. We can think Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he introduces this, right? But in terms of external adjustments, so much they're changing, right? The incorporation of the printing press, the adoption of saffron, right? All of these different things, and we're seeing today it's changing. Every single few years there's something new, and continuously, right? The senior devotees, they're constantly innovating and changing and adapting, right? Because preaching is where this dynamic aspect is most coming forth, right? And the reason why is because these material factors, they change every day. Everyone in the material world is depressed and upset, right? We all know this, right? And they're depressed and upset, so they're always changing everything. It's a new fad every year, right? I think in my lifetime, it's already happened twice where shikhas are cool, right? I'll go through a phase where shikhas aren't considered ugly, and then it'll go through, and then again, shikhas will be considered ugly again, and then they'll be considered cool again, and then they'll be considered ugly again, whatever, right? So we'll see this, right? Constantly changing, right? But here we find this is the dynamism in preaching, right? That preaching is dynamically interacting in this. Preaching is dynamically trying to bring this truth of Krishna dancing and applying it to all sorts of historical events. And we see this, right? Srila Prabhupada's first book, Easy Journey to Other Planets. What is Prabhupada doing? He's taking events and facts and ideas, scientific concepts, and he's weaving the truth of Krishna dancing through them, right? This is the mood of Srila Prabhupada, right? We'll see this, I was reading just recently, Hiding an Unnatural Happiness, right? We see the same principle there, right? We see these facts and ideas of the direction and movement of society. And these are facts and ideas that people talk about often. The self-help industry is built on it, right? But what is being weaved through there? It is the transcendental truth of Krishna dancing, right? Of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and intimacy with Him, right? So in this way, we find the essence of connection to be in preaching, in the dynamism, right, of outreach and of the Sankirtan. And it is the Sankirtan, to come back to that central point. This is a point that's sometimes made, right? Yagya, what is the greatest yagya? The greatest yagya is the Sankirtan yagya. And why is this? Because the Sankirtan yagya is a yagya by which we can place everything into the flame, right? Other yagyas we can place whatever, like some grains, some food items. But in the Sankirtan yagya, we can take all things and place it into it, right? Srila Prabhupada would talk about, putting the microphone that he was speaking in, right? Putting that into the Sankirtan yagya. We can think of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. The genre of the novel had just been introduced to India, right? Of course, the novel is a Western genre. And what did Bhaktivinoda Thakur see when he saw the genre of the novel? He saw another opportunity, another thing that can be thrown into the Sankirtan yagya. And then he wrote Prema Pradipa and Jaiva Dharma, right? Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he said the devotees who are fixing the printing machines, right? He said they are performing archana, right? He said they are performing deity worship by fixing these printing presses, right? Because all of these printing presses, they are now being placed in the Sankirtan yagya, right? And then, of course, even ourselves. We often hear of the Brihad Mridanga, right? The Brihad Mridanga, again, Mridanga is being put on that dynamic, spontaneous side of things. We hear of the Brihad Mridanga, right? But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he also spoke of the living Mridangas, right? Does anyone know what the living Mridangas refer to? He gave this in a speech to his sannyasis when he sent them over to Europe to preach. And as we know, unfortunately, it wasn't the most successful preaching mission. But before he sent them, he initiated all of them into the Narasimha Gayatri mantra, which is an interesting historical detail. But then he also gave them a wonderful speech. And he said, our only concern is to purify our hearts of all of the anarthas, right, through the preaching of this Sankirtan. And then he said, all of you, my saffron-clad disciples, you're all my living mridangas, right? Because he was making this point, right? The preaching is living, preaching is dynamic, right? The preachers, the books being distributed, they are the Brihad Mridanga, but the distributor of the books, they are the living Mridanga, right? Prabhupada, he would make this point, and I've forgotten how the Bengali goes. It's prana ache, I forgot how the rest goes, but basically it goes, if you have life, you can preach, and Prabhupada makes this point. If you are dead, if you are materially alive, which is spiritually dead, you cannot preach, right? Preaching means life, and life means truth, because life is connection to Krishna, right? And preaching is that ultimate connection to Krishna, because one is dynamically engaged, not only in connecting to Krishna, purifying oneself so that one can be connected further to Krishna, but also connecting others to Krishna. And so in this sense, Sankirtan is the ultimate yagya, and in that sense, it is, as is mentioned here, yagyartha karma, right? Work done only for the satisfaction of Vishnu. And therefore, Sankirtan is the activity that is the greatest and most pleasing to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki.